Hi, good evening. We'll give it 3 more minutes or so to let people settle in. I'm just the audio check, basically. So if you can see and hear me, all is well. We'll wait until like 1 or 2 more minutes to give people a bit more time to settle in. But other than that, welcome, good evening, or whatever time of the day it is for you, because, well, virtual events don't have that strict concept of a time anymore. Happy you're all joining us, and we'll kick it off in a moment. I'll add Chris in a little bit from Humanitec, and we'll take it away. But yeah, I'm sorry that I'm a boring AV check. We can play a little intro video to properly kick it off then. But I'll give it 1 more or 2 more minutes for people to join, and so we won't miss anybody. The general plan is we have probably content for something like 25, 30 minutes, whatever. If you have any questions, don't be shy, just ask us and we'll try to react. Either bringing your question to the screen or keeping it up for later, depending on how it goes. But yeah, we'd like to keep it as interactive as possible in general. So, I see we are already at around 10 people or so. I'll give it another minute or 2, and then we can finally kick it off properly. Well, let me switch out our background. We take this one. I think if Chris is ready, let's do the count. So, hi, Chris.
Hello.
So, you're based in Berlin, right?
I am based in Berlin, yes.
I'm based in Vienna, so it's a very European or Central European meetup, I guess. Chris, you want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, so firstly, thank you for inviting me along to this webinar. So my name is Chris, and I am CTO at Humanitec. Humanitec is a company that helps other companies build their own internal developer platforms. So what is an internal developer platform? Internal developer platform is basically a system that provides a good developer experience, and in our case focuses on allowing developers to build cloud native applications really easily. So we're focusing on things like developer self-service and reducing the pressure on the ops team so that your developers don't need to go along and say, hey, can you provision me a new Elastic instance? Instead, they can just go ahead and do that themselves and do things like provision ephemeral environments and all those kind of things, which I'm sure we'll get into as part of this webinar.
Sorry, I was just trying to catch up with chat. Stein, no visual on Chris. I can see him. You cannot see Chris? Wait, let me switch view maybe. Can you see Chris now? I hope you can see Chris now. I mean, the video was slightly blurry, but you should be there. Otherwise, I guess we'll just have to trust that you're there. Okay, there you are.
Excellent.
For whatever reason. Maybe I shouldn't make you too large. Okay, perfect. Thanks for the intro. Hi, I'm Philipp. Those who don't know me, I'm on the community team at Elastic, trying to show off what we can offer. And we thought that this might be a nice opportunity to kind of like combine preview environments and what is, or how can you make that work with or for Elastic, since we have some like, yeah, maybe special challenges with Elasticsearch that we want to dive into. So that's what we want to do. So Chris, when would I generally want to use a preview environment?
Yeah, so I guess before we jump into when to use it, it might just be worth defining what a preview environment is. So there's a few words, I guess, in the industry for this kind of environment. We have preview environments. We also have ephemeral environments. They basically mean the same thing. The key thing is that it's a full environment of your application. So like you might have a dev environment, you might have a QA or a staging environment, and you might have a production environment. An ephemeral or a preview environment is just like one of those. The only difference is that it is spun up on demand, and it generally only lives for a very short period of time. So the kind of use case you would have is if you are working on a particular feature, you might cut a feature branch, and you may want to either show it to someone, like maybe a QA engineer is interested in seeing your feature before it's merged into the main flow going through your dev, staging, and production environments. Or maybe you want to demo the feature, or maybe you want to collaborate with another engineer. Say you're a backend engineer and you want to work with a front-end engineer on a end-to-end feature. So spinning up a temporary environment, an ephemeral or a preview environment is a very useful way of being able to collaborate with kind of the full fat application running, but without the hassle of, say, blocking the dev environment, which I'm sure many people have kind of experienced. You're working on something, you take over the dev or you take over the staging environment for your feature, and at that point, no one else can deploy into that environment, and everyone's kind of stuck and getting annoyed with you because you're taking so much time and they can't get on with the things they want to do. So that's the kind of use case for preview environments. We see situations where people automate this process. So it could be that for every PR you create, you might spin up a preview environment. This means that the person who is doing the review gets a full fat version of the application to actually play around with, as well as looking at your code, which can be super helpful. Other examples could be spinning up temporary environments or ephemeral environments as part of a automatic testing. So you may run your CI pipeline, at the end, you might spin up a full environment and run some end-to-end tests on it. So those are situations where you might want to use a preview environment.
Right. And just to keep the concepts clear, because something that kind of like confused me initially, it's still kind of like, in addition to that, you would have integration tests and everything running in parallel or before that as well anyway. Correct.
So this is more an as well as on top of your current processes. So commonly you might have a shared dev environment that developers deploy into, and then you might have a QA environment that is owned by your QA team, and they will then move stuff in there and they'll do their own quality assurance on that. The preview environments are usually sit alongside the dev environments, usually not always, but most of the time alongside the dev environments, and it's something that's controlled by the developers and allows them to easily spin something up and be able to access it and then tear it down when it's done. So you can use it to run your own kind of sandbox integration test. Maybe you might use it just for QA, or you might use it to collaborate.
Right. So it's one step closer basically to get rid of the ops team.
It's one step closer to not hassling the ops team as much. Let's put it that way.
Right, that's probably the better way to phrase it, not to make any enemies. And probably the ops team is more than enough busy with other stuff anyway, rather than creating more environments for you every day.
Exactly. And I think that's a very good point, is that this is a technique that has only really been practical in the last few years with the advent of kind of cloud technologies. With kind of traditional setups, there's setting up an environment is usually a very involved process and a very manual process. So it wouldn't have been feasible to create a short-lived environment, because if you tore it down 5 minutes after the ops team set it up for you, you might get very upset. But if it's all automated and you can provision these things on demand, then it is absolutely fine to run something for 5 minutes, 3 hours, a day, and tear it down afterwards.
Right. And I guess 5 minutes is like a good point in like, what kind of resources would you start like dedicated for that environment, and what would you like to set up in a like more shared setting, which I think is one of the interesting pieces here for these preview environments.
Yeah. So if we start kind of backwards, looking at the production environment first, and kind of work our way back. So obviously your production environment is where everything will eventually end up. So in the production environment, you have provisioned resources and everything is configured for performance and for serving the use case of your customers. So for example, you might be expecting a high load. You might want to say have a system that can deal with hundreds of queries per second in your production environment. And then when you step down to, say, your staging or your QA environment, you might want something that is fundamentally the same as production, but maybe you're not going to expect hundreds of queries per second. You would instead expect a smaller number of queries for this particular setup. So in that case, you would have a kind of smaller environment, but it would be fundamentally the same. When you get to your dev environment, you're probably expecting incredibly low load, and instead you might expect to have something which is similar but not quite the same as your staging environment. So here you're optimizing for easy scale up, easy recreation, and easy kind of setup. And one of the interesting things about your dev environment, especially, is that you're going to generally try and share resources. So a kind of a classic example might be if you're using well, actually, maybe not a classic example, but a good example would be if you have a Kubernetes cluster, you might have a single cluster for your production environment, a single smaller cluster for your staging environment, and then for all of your dev environments, you might have one big but shared cluster. So you would have multiple versions of the same application running in one cluster, and you want to basically utilize the cluster as well as possible. So you would create multiple namespaces and put the same application in different stages and different namespaces. So that would be the example of a shared resource for your dev world, but you wouldn't want to do that on production because you would have performance issues, and you wouldn't want to do that on staging because you want to have it as similar to production as possible.
Right. And I think namespacing is like a good term there because, well, Kubernetes makes it easy because you have the namespaces and then you probably whatever unique identifier you have for each environment, and you can put that in a namespace and then you clean up the namespace afterwards. With relational databases or also Redis, you have like this concept of like you have a database there as well where you can kind of namespace it to some degree. The problem is in Elasticsearch, we don't really have that namespace concept in that sense. So we have been discussing a bit like where that leads us and where we can head with that. And obviously you have the two choices then. You can either set up a dedicated environment, which is nice for clean separation and like you don't have any conflicts in terms of resource use or the mapping or schema that you create is all nicely separated, but it will be slower. I mean, depending on your environment, or if you use Elastic Cloud, where it takes, I would say, 90 seconds or so to spin up a small cluster, that I guess might still be acceptable. But it still has extra overhead and is slower. And of course, it's also more expensive, which might be another factor. And then the other alternative, I guess, is since multi-tenancy in Elasticsearch is always slightly tricky, and we have a couple of blog posts which are kind of old, so it's also like hard to know where we stand right now. In the end, I guess we would have to kind of like simulate the namespaces by having some naming convention. Are you doing that for any other data stores or systems, or is that some kind of like hack that only Elasticsearch needs? So
in general, as you're correct, we have these kind of two systems. If I could just jump back to the speed question. So speed is actually surprisingly important, especially when you're talking about preview environments. Because you imagine if you have a workflow where you basically want to give someone a link immediately for a new environment, even 90 seconds might be too long to wait. So a good example would be if we have the PR process, you submit someone a PR, they get a notification in Slack that there's a new PR available. They go directly there, and in GitHub, they want to then click the link that's been inserted in the PR to access the preview environment. If the preview environment is still coming up, that's kind of annoying. They then sit twiddling their thumbs for another 45 seconds until the environment spins up. It might not seem like much, but it's probably enough to kind of block someone's flow. Another example where you may not want this is if you're doing automated testing, you're then adding a 90-second delay to your automated testing, and it's always good to keep our testing pipelines as quick as possible. And if you think about it, if the preview environment is going to be up for 5 minutes, if you have a 90-second startup time, that's actually a good proportion of the time that the preview environment is around. So I think speed is important. And I think cost as well that you mentioned. Spinning up entire new resources is obviously more expensive. Even though the resources are only going to be running for maybe 5-10 minutes, that can all add up. And especially if you end up running hundreds of preview environments. So in big organizations, it's not uncommon to have like tens or hundreds of pull requests in a day. You kind of multiply your 5-10 hour long sessions by that number of times. You actually are building up a lot of individual capacities. That cost is really exploding. So that's just kind of on the cost and the time question. But then when we look at kind of Elasticsearch and how we can try and allow customers to use a single instance, but then share it across multiple things, this kind of namespacing approach is something which we've only really kind of got into details with Elasticsearch. As you say, most of the other database technologies that most of our customers are using tend to be very much have their own internal way of namespacing. So a good example, relational databases, you create a database object within the instance. So you have a shared instance with multiple individual databases inside, and they have useful stuff like user management and roles and permissions and so on. So you can with a high degree of confidence, have one environment use one database in the same instance as another environment, and be pretty sure that they're not going to conflict. Obviously, you're still worried about load and so on, but for a preview environment, load is generally not the problem. It's more about having a real resource that you can access and work with. So in Humanitec, for example, what we allow customers to do is to be able to specify a dependency on a type of resource. So for example, if we talk about these database world, we might talk about a Postgres database. Your workload would say, hey, I need a Postgres database. When you do a deployment, Humanitec will go and generate, in the background, will go and provision a Postgres database in a particular instance, and then return a user and the name of that database and the host it's running on back to the workload so you can then access it. So in that case, we're provisioning a resource inside this instance. And then when the environment is torn down, Humanitec goes and drops that whole database so that it's cleaned up and ready for future environments to use those resources. Now, in the Elasticsearch world, and it's actually generally a kind of a NoSQL database kind of paradigm, is you tend to have the concept that the entire instance is the scope at which applications can access them. So if they can access a whole instance, then they assume they have ownership over that instance. So what you need to do there is you need to have some kind of convention-based approach if you want to share that resource. So using namespaces on the index name was a kind of an obvious step. And in consultation with Philipp, we kind of came up with a strategy which we kind of like to share with you.
Right, and I'm just trying to map that to other NoSQL data stores. Redis, I think, has the same data store or database concept that relational databases have. I think MongoDB doesn't have that either, right? So there you would also need to have like a namespace convention.
Exactly. So MongoDB would be a good example. Redis has that functionality, but one of the issues there is that it may not be something that client programs are necessarily aware of. So that's kind of more of I guess, an education thing on the Redis side, is that default setups just assume you have access to the whole thing, but actually you can create these namespaced structures inside.
Right. Yeah. Since we try to just like, how do preview environments work with different data stores? And well, obviously we'll focus on Elasticsearch, but I'm just trying to map the concepts to other things and concepts that we have. And well, I guess Kubernetes just makes it easy with the namespacing built in at the core of it, basically.
Yep.
Cool. Did you want to show the Humanitec platform in general shortly? Just how that might work for...
Yeah, so we can... maybe we just I can show as a demo for now. Here we go. So I need to share my screen.
Yes, please.
And hopefully we can see what's running up. So we were playing around with trying to set up this driver system to allow the Elasticsearch bit. Unfortunately, I wasn't 100% successful. Give another hour or so of tinkering and a bit more support from Philipp, we can get something like that actually running in Humanitec. But just to show the general principle of how this works, I can stick with an integration that we have and has kind of been production ready for a while now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create a basic application, and it's going to be made up of two containers running inside a Kubernetes cluster. So the Kubernetes cluster is already set up, and I've hooked everything together already. Just to kind of show you this principle of generating things on the fly. We have a sample app which will serve a front end, so it needs to be publicly accessible. What we can do here is we can say to Humanitec, please go and create a DNS name. And I can then define the route or the ingress. In this case, I just want to serve everything that's running on port 8080 to the outside world. So at deployment time, Humanitec will go and say, oh, we need a DNS. It'll go and provision that DNS and then generate the ingress. And then you'll be able to access this sample application from the outside world. Now, if we look here, this particular sample service that's running requires a Postgres database. So again, we do the same thing. We say, hey, I want to create a Postgres database. I'm going to add that in here. And then I need to define how to connect this to my running application. So I can basically go and create a connection string. So we can just jump in here. Actually, I think we need to start off with username. And we need a password as well. Generally a good idea. And we can then have a host. Oh, what is going on here? My trackpad is causing my mouse cursor to jump around. Host, and we need a port. And we have a name. So these are the elements that we were talking about before. So Humanitec will generate a name and it will generate a user. So we have a user and password, and it will be running on some host that the system knows about. So that's kind of the connection string that's been set up. I can go ahead and now deploy this application. First deploy. Let's go ahead with that. And what we're actually seeing in the background is Humanitec is now going to go off and say, how do I generate a Postgres database? It'll go and connect to some Postgres instance that we have set up. I think we're all running in Google Cloud at the moment, so it'll be a Google Cloud SQL instance. It'll go inside and say, okay, I'm going to generate a Postgres database. And that is the kind of namespace object that we're talking about. It's going to do the same with DNS. It's going to talk to a DNS provider and say, hey, give me a new DNS name. And we can have a look at that. So the thing seems to be up and running. If we dive into this application here, we can see we have a DNS name that's been generated. It's got a very easy to remember name. So if we go and spin that up, we have an application and we have some data. So we can have, kind of add something else. So hello world, it's a classic thing to add. And I can create that here and we have a nice application up and running. So that's really cool. We have everything kind of running. The point here about kind of creating a demo environment or a preview environment is, I guess, the important thing we want to discuss. So if I take my development environment here, I may want to create a preview environment. So let's call it preview. Let's call it preview 3, just because there was 1 and 2 there already. I can go ahead and create that. And what you can see here is we have a clone of what's running in our development environment. And so if I want to deploy this, what would be great in preview 3, what would be great is if we had a new database generated and a new DNS name, so we had these things isolated from each other. And then you could imagine I could change configuration, I could update the code in this environment without affecting what's running in the initial one. So this gives us a kind of basic setup here. Give it a few seconds, and we should have a similar situation. So we can now look at what's running, and we have a different DNS name. You're going to have to take my word for it, this is kind of Breitenberg something, and this is Brown Bosco something. But if we load this up, we have different data from preview 3. I go ahead and look at that, and we have these two things not talking to each other. They're running separately from each other. So that's kind of the idea of these preview environments. I can then go ahead and say, well, maybe I'm done with this. I want to delete it. I can take it away. It'll then disappear. Humanitec will go into the background and then clean everything up. So that's kind of the principle of how it works. And what we were trying to work out is how we can do the same with Elasticsearch. So what would be great is if we had one Elasticsearch running, maybe in the Elastic Cloud, and then we could just take that and then get every single one of our preview environments to use a subset of that particular Elasticsearch instance. And the approach we came up with is basically to use the fact that Humanitec is going ahead and provisioning bits and pieces inside these instances. And the idea was to go and create a user and create an index. We call it an index key, which is basically a portion of the index name, which has to be used as part of this structure. And then we create a role, and that role allows access to all of the indices that have this index key in it. So that gives you some way of providing isolation between the various preview environments, but also allowing you to run everything in the same instance. Now, obviously, this requires kind of code.
Can I just demo that for 3 minutes?
Go ahead.
Wait, let me kick off your screen. Let me add mine. So we're just simulating this now since it isn't built out, but I think this is something that should work pretty nicely here. So basically, since if you know Elasticsearch, security is free since 7.1. So you could use this on-premise or on cloud or wherever. And how security generally works is you tie together a role with a user. So I would, for example, create a Humanitec environment 1. So that's kind of like what the platform would do. And then I give it for the index pattern environment 1 _, basically that pattern. I give it all the privileges. So I can create that role. Then I use a user. And the username, by the way, is this one here in the creation and not the email address, because that's what always confuses me. And I basically set the password environment 1 password. And it uses that Humanitec environment 1 role that we have created before. And then with that user, we could create environment 1, whatever indices that we want to do. I'll also create a second environment and user with the same thing. So this is kind of like how we simulate the environment 1 and 2 here. And now to actually bring in the different calls, I'll fall back to plain curl because, well, that is where I can easily switch out the users. Let me just paste that in here. So what I want to do here is I create with my Humanitec environment 1 user and password. I create in this namespace. I create some data and that has succeeded, and well, I can read that back. And thanks to the username concept, those are still pretty well kind of like isolated against each other. Let me make this pretty. So now you can see we just got our environment 1 back. So this is kind of like what we're trying to read here. If I would try to read the same thing with my Humanitec 2 user, just for the isolation idea, that one would obviously fail because that one cannot read anything from the other environment. And so even though they're running in the same Elasticsearch instance, as long as you're sticking to the naming convention, they will still be pretty well isolated. And then, so just to show you, we have a lot of default indices as well, but somewhere in here we have this one index. If we want to spin down the environment, what Chris has just shown us as well, we can use a wildcard, and everything in that environment or everything with that prefix, basically all the indices will be deleted. And then I can drop the user and the role, and then we're all cleaned up. And we're basically back to before or normal. So that's kind of the idea how you can make that preview environment or fast spin up and everything work. I think the only downside is basically that your application needs to always keep that prefix, or whenever your application talks to Elasticsearch, you need to keep the prefix in mind.
Yeah. So the way that we suggest that you do that is similar to how if you're connecting to a relational database system, you would have parameterizations, you'd have maybe environment variables for the host and the port and so on. Is that you would just have an environment variable that allows for this index key, and you can then use that throughout. So I think it's an interesting approach, and it really unlocks the ability to get fast preview environments while using Elasticsearch. Obviously, this is not something which you'd want to necessarily use on production. On production, you should probably be running your own instance of Elasticsearch for each bit. But what we're talking about here is the practicality of development environments. So I can see the comments, some people saying it's a little bit of a hacky solution, a bit of a working around namespacing. It is exactly working around namespacing. A hacky solution or idiomatic solution, it depends on where you're coming from, I guess.
Right. Well, I guess it's kind of like trade-offs in systems. If you don't have a proper namespace system built in, then you need to find a workaround. I'm not sure, or I wouldn't be aware that anything is planned for that in Elasticsearch, to be honest. So I think for now, we would have to stick to some kind of namespacing convention for that.
Yeah, and I think also from a technology point of view, the focus for Elasticsearch is to be blazingly fast on specific structures. So you generally don't want to have a kind of multiple different applications or different environments running in the same Elasticsearch instance, especially in production. What we're talking about here is specifically enabling development setups that will allow for certain modern workflows that might not be possible. If you were to add namespacing to Elastic, then all of a sudden you introduce all sorts of other things which will compete against the core aims of actually having direct kind of focused usage for an Elasticsearch cluster.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think it's kind of like, I don't want to say an outlier, but it's kind of like not the core focus of what people are trying to achieve with Elasticsearch. Also because resource isolation and everything else for production would be poor. So I think it would lead people on the wrong path, basically, by having these namespaces, and then everybody tries to throw like 5 things into one, and then you fight for resources, and then nobody will be happy. So I think we'll have to stick to that workaround. With that, did anybody want to ask any questions besides commenting on how hacky the solution might be? But Chris, you have that in production for MongoDB as well already, right?
So we don't have that yet for MongoDB. We're trying this out for the first time with Elastic. So you are our guinea pigs or trailblazers, depending on how you want to set it up. But I say it's in development now. We've got the kind of proof of concept working, and we want to kind of smooth over the rough corners and hopefully get that out in the next few weeks. Nice.
Well, I think it's kind of nice to have like the meetups on the very cutting edge to show what is coming and what is possible, and kind of like what sharp edges are, for example, around Elasticsearch as well, and how you can work around them. So I hope that everybody could take something away to that. Let me add that question. Chris, I'll totally leave that up to you.
Okay, interesting. So the answer to this question could be like a whole webinar in itself. So I'll just give the kind of brief answer. So there's a few kind of options here. One, the question is how you actually want to isolate your applications. So a question might be, you have these 400 applications. Do you want to spin up all of these things? From a cost perspective, it's generally not a good idea to try and spin up all 400 applications, especially as part of an ephemeral or preview environment. What you tend to want to do is to, depending on the architecture of applications, obviously I don't know the details of how things are set up, but if you have relatively well-factored services, then you may very well be able to use a kind of canonical instance. So what we see people do, for example, is to have a set of canonical services for dev, and then the preview environment will spin up the bit that you actually want to do your PR on, and it will be automatically plumbed into the canonical environments. So a classic example is auth. You may want to have a shared auth service that's every service that runs in a dev preview environment connects to. That way you don't need to spin up a separate auth server for every single preview environment. And then this would mean that you don't need to spin up all 400 legacy applications. You just need to make sure that you spin up an environment for the application that you're concerned about. And then that will be plumbed into the currently existing 400 environments, 400 applications. But they will be common across all preview environments. It's kind of similar to what we were just talking about with spinning up a single Elasticsearch instance and then having multiple things inside. In the same way, you could use your wider dev environment as a single instance and then spin up multiple versions of your application in preview environments that then connect to the same instance. Does that answer your question?
I hope it does. And I'm kind of afraid to try to pronounce the username. If not, please specify again. Anybody else with any questions? Otherwise, well, we're coming close to the 40-minute mark, which I think is a good time anyway. Okay, looks like that one was good. Final chance for any other questions. If you can say that, Chris, how many production users do you already have?
So we have a number of production companies. Currently not a huge number of people running systems in production, but we have a load of them. We have a lot more companies that are using Humanitec for their development setups. So we're talking here about managing development environments and so on, and maybe they're running production, still deploying production systems themselves. So it's something we're seeing changing over time. As people get comfortable with the platform, they start moving more and more of their workloads into actually deploying everything with Humanitec all the way through to production.
Makes sense. I see that Matthew has added a question. Do you see many people spinning up a cloud instance of ES in dev, but on-prem in production? I'm not really sure that it's super common because probably your ops team also wants to kind of like work on a dev environment to get to know their stuff. I'm always kind of critical to change too much between dev and prod because if you don't have prior experience and if you haven't tried it out exactly like you did before, bad things will happen to you at some point. We have, since cloud now has a public API and a Terraform integration, we have a couple of users who basically spin up instances dynamically to just run, probably not a preview environment, but to either run some longer integration test or just to demo some specific features. So it is common that people do that more dynamically now. But I think most people, once they're kind of like used to one way or the other, they want to stick to that. I guess the idea here is because you don't want to give or hand out your production data to a cloud provider. Or why would you want to do that? Or because your production data store or production Elasticsearch instance is so much larger that it might be very expensive? Or I'm not really sure why you might want to do that.
So if I could jump in here, we do actually see a lot of customers running their dev environments in the cloud and then running production on premise. Not necessarily with Elasticsearch, but definitely across a whole range of technologies. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is to do with compliance. And then we see a lot of customers, especially large financial institutions, can't, or for whatever reason, are not allowed to host their production data in third-party clouds. And especially when kind of the location of the clouds and so on is problematic and so on. This is especially true for Germany. They tend to be very strict on data privacy. But we'll see development environments happening in the cloud, and then deployments to production will happen on-prem in their own data centers. And you then, obviously, as you mentioned, Philip, we've got the problem of how do you manage the transition between the two? A lot of these things are made a lot easier by things like Kubernetes. If you're running Kubernetes on-premise and in the cloud, then the API that the developers talk to is the same. So it doesn't really matter if one is running in Azure and the other one is running on-premise. That kind of works fine. And I guess with something like Elasticsearch, if you view just the Elasticsearch box as a platform, then from the application perspective, it's the same. Obviously, operating Elasticsearch on-premise versus operating Elasticsearch in the cloud is a very different proposition.
Right. I always have a hard time with that. I know the German-speaking world is very much on like we want to own the data center and whatever. But there are also so many financial institutions who don't have to do that. So often I feel like it's a bit of an excuse, or it's just because they're used to that, or job security. I'm never sure.
Yeah, it's definitely something we see though.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess, and for even for us, it's like, okay, you start with cloud for testing, good. Better you start somewhere than you keep everything on-prem, because it's probably easier to convert to full cloud in the long run if you have something there already rather than starting from scratch.
Yeah.
And of course, for preview environments, a dynamic cloud environment where you can easily scale up and down and you don't need to screw in new servers into racks will make your life a lot easier.
Definitely.
Well, I hope we answered that question. If there is nothing else, Chris, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
I hope everybody learned something. Enjoy your morning, evening, afternoon, whatever. We'll have a few more meetups coming up, so we won't be far away. Thanks everybody for joining, and have a good day. Bye.
Bye.